So what we'd like to do now is invite Karen Schwab, one of our members, up to do our introduction of our guest speaker today. Karen?
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Come on, we got to get warmed up for our next speaker, right? It's a great afternoon. I'm so happy to see so many people here, and it's so good to be out and talking and being with people. And then it just brings so much more pleasure to our Optimist group to be able to be here and see you individually. So we already have had quite a great meeting so far. It's hard to believe it's going to get better, but I think it is going to get better. So our speaker today, Shea, I was trying to figure out how I would introduce him, and I just wanted to stay distinguished. Does that sound pretty good? Yeah. Those of you that know him, we're really lucky. We have a lot of great speakers here, and he's going to be joining us today. And I asked him what was it that he wanted me to say, because you all read that fabulous bio and know that he's come from some really great places. But first he said that he was at St. Thomas. He was professor at St. Thomas. I said, yeah, I graduated from St. Thomas. That is great. He's a federal prosecutor, wonderful, and we're going to hear a lot more about that today. He's a veteran, and so I thank you for your service and being here today. But I also noticed on his bio, and he didn't say it, but I think he would probably say this, he's probably the proud father of 4 young, wonderful adults. Would that be correct?
Amen.
Amen. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speaker today, Shea.
Well, thank you, Karen, for that very nice introduction. And more importantly, I want to thank, I hope I say it right, Alessia, the young woman who sang the Ukrainian national anthem. I wish every American could hear you sing that. So to get right to the purpose of my talk, I think that the title we finally agreed upon was the importance of ethics, character, and optimism. I'm going to try and cover all 3 in the brief time available, but I want to emphasize that I have found in the past that when I talk, there are often more questions than answers, so I will be available afterwards. I know that time is precious today to answer anybody's questions that we may not be able to cover. As you heard, I spent most of my career as a prosecutor here in Minnesota, 20 years, and almost all of that was white-collar crime cases. I did some violent crime cases in the very beginning, but 18 of those 20 years were as a prosecutor prosecuting, frankly, people who looked a lot like all of you. People who were educated, people who had opportunity, and for a variety of reasons went down very wrong and dark paths that led them into the criminal justice system. But after about 10 years of doing this, I realized I could be a prosecutor for the rest of my life and I would be fulfilled, bringing justice to individual victims, trying to make them as whole as possible, but it would not be enough. And I decided then that I was going to try and take a different view on being a prosecutor. And we don't have time to cover some of the experiments that I engaged in, but for example, early on I took a year and I devoted half my time as a volunteer at St. Thomas dealing with ethics, mostly business ethics, but it soon became something that transformed into ethics for all students, high school students in particular. And I'll get to that a little bit later. At the same time, I realized I wanted to make an impact in the classroom that others were not able to make. And how did I do that? I approached several people who I had prosecuted, who had gone to prison, and asked them if they'd be willing to go and tell their stories to students. And we started with business school students, MBA programs, and law schools, but that soon became a much larger project, and high school students became probably our largest audience. And it was a way I felt that I could bring ethics not just into the classroom, but into auditoriums and have them hopefully remember the story of the person who was explaining to them why they had made the decisions they did that ended them up in the criminal justice system and in most cases sent them to prison. So long story short, that was about 20 years ago, and I have done since that time probably 300 to 350 such presentations, many here in Minnesota, but actually around the country. and I've worked with more than 36 former offenders, only about a third of whom I prosecuted. I'm going to tell you about just 2 of their stories today, and we'll give you a snapshot of what I think ethics education can be. George Klein is a name most of you probably will no longer recognize, but he's had quite a history here in Minnesota. He had the scoring record in Williams Arena for college basketball for quite a number of years, played professional basketball with the Lakers, was not making enough money back then, so he returned to Minnesota and became a stockbroker. Became very successful as a stockbroker, later became an investor, an angel investor. He helped create over 40 Minnesota companies, sat on the board of directors of most of those companies. And about 20 years ago, through some odd circumstance, in another case, information was brought to us, the U.S. Attorney's Office, that he had been cheating in the stock market. Hard to believe. Fabulously wealthy, homes up on the North Shore in Minneapolis and Phoenix, and kind of revered in the investment community. Long story short, I ended up prosecuting him and his only 2 sons, as well as a number of other people. George did not want to cooperate with us, went to prison, up in the prison camp up in Duluth, and I got a call from his lawyer, Doug Kelly, some of you might recognize, and Doug said, Hank, George is ready to talk. He got a long sentence, and he was an older gentleman. And he came down and he started talking, and I ended up prosecuting some other people who you might not recognize, but we won't go into all that. George cooperated. And I was sitting with him at one point with the FBI and the SEC in a conference room, and I said, George, you used to teach at the Carlson School. It's our top MBA program at the U of M. You used to teach at St. Thomas, MBA students. Would you be willing to come and speak to MBA students about how you, who had a career that they are all aspiring to, lost it? And he agreed. And this is back in 2003, and I wasn't affiliated with St. Thomas then, but I asked St. Thomas to host it, and the only problem was, a week before the event, they called up and said, we have like 450 RSVPs, and we don't have a space large enough to host it. So anybody know about the First Baptist Church across the street from the law school in downtown Minneapolis? Big church, and that's where we had it. And George came out in prison clothing, escorted by 2 FBI agents. He was still in federal custody, brought him down from the Duluth prison camp, and he spoke only for about a half an hour. And I could talk a whole lecture on that, but at the end of it, these MBA students came up to me and said, we don't know why you arranged this. We hear you're a prosecutor, and you're the one who sent George Klein to prison, but that is something that we will never forget for the rest of our careers. George said at the very end, I hope to get out of prison before I die. But even if I do, I will always be a felon. And then he walked off the stage. So I realized then that I had the opportunity to do something special and different for students. And we now fast forward, the last presentation I did, just earlier this summer, Boys State, I don't know if you're familiar with Boys State and Girls State, Great American Legion program. I've spoken there for about, my son took part in it 20 years ago. I've spoken in there almost every summer since, and I've always brought a former offender with me. This time I brought somebody that might be of extreme interest to the Ukrainian students and guests we have here today. His name is Lee Sprague, and you can Google him and look him up, but he was a very successful lawyer in New York. He had actually spent time in Russia. He spoke Russian as well as I think 3 other languages. Decided he wanted to go back to Russia, worked for a law firm there, but wanted more. So he went to work for an oligarch, and he helped that oligarch bring his company public, a communications company. New directors, new owners, he's going to have to find a new job. He has a choice, does he come back to the United States or does he stay in Russia? Well, he had met a Russian woman, he had 2 children, he's going to stay in Russia. And he goes to work for a different oligarch. I don't know how many of you would recognize the name, Oleg Deripaska, but he certainly has been in the news over the last 4 or 5 years, and he goes to work for Deripaska. And if Lee Sprague were here, he would tell you it was a gradual descent into hell. It started with minor transgressions, lying to banks, money laundering, and bribery, kickbacks, the whole 9 yards. And he realizes that he has become corrupted. And his wife says, you actually are more Russian now than you're American. And he puts a lot of import on that. And he decides he's got to get out. The guilt is overwhelming, some of the things that he's done. So what's he going to do? He's going to steal money from Deripaska and then go and live in the United States. And he was smart enough at this point, he's a very good lawyer, was a very good lawyer, that he figures out the foolproof crime and steals $10 million from something that only Deripaska, him, and one other person knew about. Deripaska had a net worth of about $30 billion when he went to work for him. I'm sure it's much less now. But he steals the $10 million and is trying to get his exit strategy to work, and the guilt is overwhelming. He becomes addicted to codeine. Codeine's over the counter in Russia. It's how he sleeps at night. Long story short, he decides $10 million is not enough. And just as before he's going to leave Russia, he tries to steal another $5 million. And he gets caught. Sort of. He flees Russia, leaves his wife and 2 children behind in Moscow. There's a whole story you can read about it on the internet if you want, but eventually he comes back to the United States, gets his wife and kids out. He strikes a deal with Deripaska to pay back the money. And then the U.S. government comes calling. And for those of you who have been following Deripaska, the FBI has been very interested in him for a long time because he's so close to Putin. And they prosecute him. Some of the money he laundered for his Malibu home in California came through a U.S. bank, and that's a crime, even though you don't really think of it when you steal it from a person in another country. And he doesn't want to cooperate. And there's reasons for that, mostly involving his family. So he gets prosecuted, pleads guilty, goes to prison in California, comes out, he's on a release, and he contacts me at St. Thomas. This is about 5 years ago. Tells me his background. I've now taken him to a number of law schools. When I took him to Harvard, several people came up to me, professors, and said, you know, you've brought a number of people here to the law school over the years, Hank, but this guy's important. He went to Columbia Law School. He was a superstar there. And all of these people in the seats out there are saying, my God, if it can happen to him, maybe it could happen to me. The message. The message that Lee gave to these young men at Boise State is the same one he's given in every talk that I've accompanied him to. It all begins with a small, single, intentional, wrongful step. And after you do it the first time, it almost always presents itself again. And it gets a little bit easier. After the second or third time you start doing something you know is wrong, your conscience is not speaking to you in the same way. And you've heard about the slippery slope. It really is a slippery slope. And he personifies that. But the other part of the story for him is an effort to seek redemption. These people that appear with me don't get anything from the courts. They don't get anything in terms of payment. They're doing this because they're trying to make amends for what they had done to society. They're trying to seek some form of personal redemption. And their recovery is very much bound up in that. So for me, it's always been something that the person who makes the presentation has to say at the end of it, I got something positive out of this. Most of these people are convicted felons. Almost all of them are, and they don't hear applause very often these days in their lives. But these students who hear their stories almost invariably applaud them. There's a lot more I could talk about that, but I want to be sensitive to the time. After I'd done maybe 50 or 60 of these presentations, I decided I would try and compile a list of all the lessons that I was learning from these former offenders. And it's on the St. Thomas website, and I have a couple cards that I can provide your club members if you want to take a look. It's the top 10 list of lessons learned from the failure of others. And if I have time, I can just go into some of those. It's a whole talk in itself, but the last lesson I think is the most important. It's sort of like David Letterman. Again, I'm dating myself here, but you sort of start with number 10, you finish number 1. The number 1 lesson is about character. So I've talked a little bit about ethics. Character is, above all else, in your life, at all times, act with integrity, exhibit courage, and honor your reputation. And I'll just say that we've already heard today the best example of courage we see on the news every night. And that's what the people of Ukraine have done in defending their homeland. But courage is for everybody. It's not just for the heroes in Ukraine, and I praise all of them, but it's for each of us here in the room. We are all confronted with things that require us to step up and speak up. The bullying in schools, the time when the powerless are not being heard, and you have the ability to speak up on their behalf. When freedom and justice is at issue, to stand up for what's right. Those are things that should be part of all of our lives. And when we do that, we honor our reputation. I mean, that's what our legacy is all about. It's about what we have done in our lives for others, for right, and for justice. Now, the world is full of gloomy, sad news. And again, Dave kind of alluded to this in, I thought, the excellent summary you gave about the Optimist Creed. I don't need to talk about our own country's issues with dishonesty and mistrust and greed. And it's not just in this country. Or the world's issues, the war in Ukraine, the famine, the disease, and not just COVID. But as optimists, the question should be, what can we do about it? What does this mean for us? And on a very micro level, I see Sarah Paul here today. It's so nice to see her. It's been quite a number of years. But she and I devoted quite some time to trying to improve ethics in high schools here in Minnesota. And I remember giving a speech about 10 years ago, similar to a group like this, about what we can do to make things different. And I said it's about improving our state's and our nation's ethical character. How do we teach people? How do we mentor people to become ethical citizens and leaders? And I really have an optimistic view of the future. As much as the bad news can be found all over our media, I believe that the answer to ethics in our society starts through education. And the second equally important aspect, once you've completed your education, is service to others. So what do I mean by that? I mean, ideally, ethics, values start in the home. For some, that's not happening. And I won't get into all the statistics, but you're probably aware of them. Too many broken homes. Too many families struggling just to get by, not able to talk about nurturing anything. So it then turns to society, and all of us have to look to our education system to find a path forward to be creating these ethical citizens for our future. And how do we do that? And that's a whole another talk. I'd be happy to share ideas. Sarah has ideas. I mean, there are many people in this state continuing to work on that. But it's important to do it in our formative years. And that's why it's so encouraging to see these students from Ukraine. They're coming here at a time that you are forming the type of person you're going to become. You're creating your value system. You're creating what is going to be important to you for the rest of your life, even if you don't really recognize it. I was fortunate on more than one occasion in my formative years to go and live in France with a family that didn't speak English. And several years later to travel around the world, visiting countries in South America and Africa and Asia, all while being sponsored by a group like this. And I learned more in those months in France and traveling around the world than I learned in all of my years of classroom education. And I had a wonderful classroom education. But the sacrifices that you're making to come here, the people that you're meeting are going to stay with you for the rest of your lives. Service to others, I mean, I don't need to be talking to the Optimist Club about this. This is what your creed is about. It's about what you live on a regular basis. Let me just tell you one thing that has become important to me. You have only a limited number of years on this earth. You have to decide how you're going to spend them. I've done what I can in the classroom. I think that I've done what I can with the programs that I've talked about. But there's one group of people who I am very attuned to in this country, and I will be for the next couple years for sure, and that is our veterans. 3 million Americans served in either Afghanistan or Iraq. I mean, it's a mind-blowing number, but those conflicts went on for 20 years. And we have 3 million who've come home, and we've saved a lot of lives that we couldn't have saved even 20 years ago because of advances in medicine and the like. But too many of them have come home with invisible injuries, injuries that they suffered on our behalf. And I'm talking about PTSD and traumatic brain injury, drug abuse, because they can't sleep at night without using the drugs or resorting to the alcohol. And too many of them, good people, people who served our nation honorably, find themselves getting involved in the criminal justice system. And for the Vietnam vets, again, I won't go into all the statistics, our reaction was, these are dangerous people. They learned how to kill, and we put them in prison, in jail. And none of them got better in prison or jail. And now we're faced with the same issue again. Are we going to take these veterans who do have serious issues and put them in jail? They'll eventually get out. They will not be better. They may well be worse. Or do we do something to help them get back to being productive members of society? Efforts underway. I'm part of just one of them, the Veterans Defense Project. And you may not know it, but Minnesota has become a national leader in the last 2 years. Our legislature last summer, 2021, passed the very first Veterans Restorative Justice Act in the country. And if a veteran commits an offense, that's not a presumptive prison sentence. And in Minnesota, that's most offenses. The judge has the discretion to say to the veteran, go to treatment. Get better. I will supervise you. We will support you. If you decide you don't want treatment, then you're going to have to face the legal consequences of jail or whatever. And the track record we have established in the last 10 years in the state, step by step, mostly in metro counties here, has been phenomenal. Again, I could go on at length, but I'd be happy to talk to any of you. I brought some Veterans Defense Project cards if you want to find out anything more about this. But I'm being sensitive to the time here. I want to share something with our Ukrainian guests. Maybe they've heard this before, maybe they haven't, but I hope it will speak to all of them and speak to all of us about the situation that their country is facing right now. Winston Churchill is one of my favorite people, has made a lot of famous speeches during his life, but two of the most famous are ones I just like to quote from today, because I think it speaks to what we all should be thinking about regarding Ukraine. The first was on June 4th, 1940. He had just become prime minister. France was in the position of falling to the Nazis. Happened a few weeks later. And he spoke to Parliament, maybe for the first time as prime minister. And part of that speech was this: we shall not flag or fail. We shall go on to the end. We shall defend our nation, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender. And that was a rallying cry for the British people. 18 months later, he gave what many people call his never give up speech, but I did some research, and here's what he actually said to students at one of British's Harrow Hall schools. 18 months Britain had survived. It was clear they were not going to be invaded. We were shortly going to be joining them in the war. But he said to the students, this is the lesson. Never give in. Never give in. Never, 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 never. Nothing, great or small, large or petty, never give in, except to convictions of honor and good sense. Never yield to force. Never yield to the apparently overwhelming might of the enemy. And I'll paraphrase him now. We now find ourselves in a position that we only have to persevere to prevail. So may Ukraine and may all of us who believe in freedom, who are willing to defend freedom, never give in. Never, never, never. Thank you.